Hey there, everybody. Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us today for this presentation on IDEA Section 504 and ADA done by ASN team member John Poulos. If you are in need of captions, I want to direct y'all to look for the rectangular box down at the lower bar. It's a little rectangular box. It has CC in it. If you click that button, it'll activate captions. As we go through the presentation, if you have questions, please feel free to submit them in the Q&A box, and we will hopefully be able to answer your questions at the end of the presentation. We're going to give another minute for folks to trickle in, and then John will go ahead and get started. So, John, I will pass it to you.
Thank you. Um, Hello, everybody. My name is John Poulos, pronouns he, him. Visual description, I am a white guy in my mid-20s with short to mid-length wavy brown hair, a beard. I'm in a burgundy polo today with a green background wall. I am a policy analyst here at the Autistic Self-Advocacy Network. What that means is that I am heavily involved in our legislative and regulatory work. That means meeting with members of Congress and their staff if the administration puts out or wants to change a regulation, working on public comments and analyzing how it impacts our community, and also coordinating with our operations and communications team on policy-specific questions that reach you all. So today we're going to be talking about IDEA, the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act, and portions of the Americans with Disabilities Act. And the reason that we're talking about all these is because they all play a role in education. And so we're going to break down what they are and why they matter. So I just gave a brief rundown of what these laws were, but I'll say it again. We have the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, abbreviated as IDEA, often says as IDA very quickly. Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act of 1973, and the Americans with Disabilities Act. So we're going to start with the Individuals with Disability Education Act. It was originally passed in 1975 and was called the Education for All Handicapped Children Act, EAHCA, first. And the purpose of this legislation is to support the rights of infants, toddlers, and children with disabilities in schools. When it was reauthorized in 1990, that's when it was renamed to the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. And a notable part of this reauthorization in 1990 is that it was the first time that it included autistic people as a specific disability category that could be covered under IDEA. It also introduced the concept of transition planning, starting at the age of 16. Transition planning meaning when a child or student with a disability reaches 18 and becomes an adult, there are changes around the legal authority and as those rights as you enter into adulthood. And so how do you ensure that those rights are protected and you could have a level of independence that is guaranteed under the law? And just very briefly, that while EHCA passed in 1975, it is not the first piece of legislation to focus on the education of students with disabilities. The Rehabilitation Act of 1973, as we're going to talk about with Section 504, doesn't only cover education, but certainly covers part of it. And there's legislation going back to the late 1950s around educating special education teachers, specifically on how to provide specialized instruction for students with disabilities, as well as specific grant money that was passed in legislation in the 1960s. So before 1970, so before IDEA was a thing, U.S. schools educated only 1 in 5 disabled children. In fact, some states even had laws that explicitly excluded students who were deaf, blind, intellectually disabled, or had mental health disabilities. And those disabled students who were in school often didn't get much help or teaching. So what IDEA does is it ensures that the students who are covered up until their high school graduation or age 21, whatever comes first. So now we're going to walk through what are some of the specific rights that IDEA covers for students with disabilities. So this law says that all students have a right to a free and appropriate public education. So there's 4 parts to that. So what does FAPE really mean? So when we say free, that means learning at school should not cost disabled students or their families money. That is covered by the public school, which primarily gets its funding by people paying their state and local taxes or through grant money from the federal government. Appropriate means that the student gets to learn in a way that is accessible to them, a way that you may or may not be familiar with is through something called an individualized education plan, or an IEP for short, which we'll talk about soon. Next slide, please. When we say public, that refers to what these services and education are provided by and who they're watched by. So it's overseen by the government. At a public school, you have government employees like teachers and school administrators, school psychologists, and social workers. And it is an engagement with the parents of the student and, of course, the student themselves. And when we say education, that doesn't just mean the academic components like math class or English, but all of the services that may be covered by a IEP and provided by the school, like counseling or speech therapy. So IDEA also talks about that students need to be educated in something called the least restrictive environment, or LRE. The reason behind this is that every student has the right to learn. And in order to guarantee that, it says that most disabled students should be in the same classrooms as people without disabilities, commonly known as having an inclusive classroom or mainstreaming. The reason why this least restrictive environment is so important is that disabled students should get what they need to learn in non-disabled classrooms as well. That inclusivity is incredibly important. In fact, we talk about it on the next slide. It helps all students learn together by including everyone in the education, in the lesson plan. It helps teach students about differences with one another, and how to include people with disabilities in society, even beyond the public education system, which ultimately makes the school a better place to learn. So those are the main rights and structure provided by IDA. So I'm going to walk through how you go about accessing services. So even before the student or parent or guardian gets involved in the process to access services, the local education agency, which includes the school district, the school itself, is tasked with something called Child Find. And what that means is the school has a responsibility to look for disabled students in the community, in the public, which includes any potential child with a disability, whether they're homeless, regardless of immigration status. That is the responsibility of the school. Now, students, parents, or legal guardians can ask for an evaluation if they suspect that the student has a disability that may be covered under IDA. Well, the school does not have to say yes. If there is a reason for suspecting that disability, they do have to say yes. So you can't just go up and say, oh, I want an evaluation. The school will then ask why, and there will have to be a reason, whether it's a diagnosis, or it's there's a sign of struggling with the student is struggling with their grades because of a reason that could be related to a disability, or having a hard time socially, anything that could potentially be connected to a disability. And if that's the case, the school then has to agree to the evaluation. So if you get to the point where the school says yes, that evaluation that they do is free. You do have the right to a private evaluation as well, but that is something that usually you would have to pay for. In certain situations where the free evaluation is not available because of, say, the school has limited resources, or there are complicating factors to why that particular disability for the student may not be picked up in the free evaluation, then the school may pay for a private evaluation, but that is exceedingly rare. If the school says no, you do have the right to something called an independent educational evaluation. Again, this is something that you usually would have to pay for. There is a process to get the school to pay for it, but that is a hearing-based process where there is a back and forth, and ultimately that meeting would be the deciding factor of who has to pay for the independent educational evaluation. So say now the student has been approved for services after the evaluation, then it's a matter of, okay, what do those services look like? How are those defined? And that's in what we call an individualized education plan or an IEP. And to get an IEP, the student has to have one of at least 13 disability categories defined in IDA. So not every disability necessarily qualifies under IDA. Some things are specified, like learning disabilities or autism. There is even a specific category for multiple disabilities. But say ADHD, for example, may or may not qualify for an IEP. It is not explicitly named as one of the 13 categories, but depending on what the student's challenges are in the education system as a student with ADHD, then from that, they may qualify under one of the 13 categories. The law does specify that to receive an IEP, the disability must make the student experience at school harder. This can mean grades, like academic performance, or social experience, whether the student is experiencing bullying or having difficulty making friends, or it could be any number of things that could fall under student experience. Next slide, please. Thank you. So what is actually in an IEP? It's not just one single document. There are a few parts to it. So there's something called the present level of performance, or PLOP, of the student. And this is a document or collection of documents that are written out by the student's teacher or the school psychologist or a mix of the people who are providing services and education to the student, that defines how the student is doing academically and functionally as it relates to their disability. So like I just said, examples can be how is the student performing in class? Are they able to follow along with the lesson plan? If with the services that they are provided, are they doing well in the class? How are they doing socially? How are they doing emotionally? These are all things that would be written out in a plop. There are also additional documents. The first set of being specifying what the details are for individualized instruction. So these are the services that the student is being provided. So this would be like speech therapy or maybe occupational therapy, or if the student has a full-time aide, if the student is blind, then Braille or could be included within this section as well. And then you have the set of details of supports like specific accommodations and assistive technology. So things like letterboards, augmentative and alternative communication devices, and those collection of documents is what is in an IEP. So who writes an IEP? Well, it's a collaborative effort. So while the plop, as I described, is written by the school employees who are providing services, like the teachers, the school psychologist, social worker, whoever is involved in providing services to the student. It is done in conjunction with the parents and student as well. So, like I said, school employees can include teachers, administrators, paraprofessionals, school psychologists, and parents and students don't have to be alone in a IEP meeting or when writing or in the process of writing the IEP. You can also have an additional advocate present. In fact, actually, next slide first, please. Something that I want to emphasize is that schools cannot ban parents from coming to an IEP meeting if the student is 18 years or older. It is ultimately up to the student who else is present on their behalf. It can vary state to state depending on guardianship status of the student and guardianship and competency laws. But ultimately, anyone can come to an IEP meeting with an adult high school student's consent. And just real quick, last bullet on that slide. A school must follow an approved individualized education plan. If they do not follow an IEP, they are not following the law and they aren't respecting the student's rights. And there is, that is something that you could potentially sue over because of that violation of rights. But there are other steps that often happen before that, but we can talk about that later. Next slide, please. So moving on to Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act of 1973. The Rehabilitation Act is a very big law. It covers a lot as it pertains to people with disabilities. And even Section 504 is not education specific. What it says is that places that get money from the government, specifically from the federal government, cannot discriminate against disabled people. So this would be public schools. So your local public school receives money from the federal government. Public colleges and universities, even some private colleges and university because of financial aid. Doctors' offices, if they receive money from the federal government because of Medicaid or Medicare. Workplaces, if they receive federal dollars. And of course, government buildings and websites because they are run by the government and thus receive federal funds. So who is covered under Section 504 is much larger than who is covered under IDA. The specific quote is a person with a physical or mental impairment which substantially limits one or more major life activities. So what could fall under Section 504? Autism could be qualifying, ADHD, epilepsy, cystic fibrosis, and even food allergies. So when we're talking about Section 504 in schools, Section 504, there's the law, but there's also implementing regulations in particular areas. So Section 504 has regulations for education. It has regulations for healthcare. It has regulations for housing. And when you read the Section 504 education regulations, which I believe were, I want to say 1975, they haven't been updated since actually. It also protects a student's right to a free and appropriate public education, just as IDA does. And it carries the same meaning that it does under IDA around a free and appropriate public education. So just to give some examples again of some of the assistive technology that is required to be provided under Section 504, that could be an iPad, it could be a computer, it could be a letterboard, it could be having larger print, it could be having sign language interpreters, or having support workers like a paraprofessional. It's important to note that Section 504 in schools, when we talk about what that looks like and how it's implemented in kindergarten through 12th grade. Oh, I'm sorry. Next slide, please. Getting ahead of myself. So, Section 504 covers everywhere that we said before, everywhere that receives federal dollars. When we're talking about schools that cover elementary and secondary education, so that's kindergarten to 12th grade, in public schools, there can be a set of documents called a Section 504 plan that contains what supports a student needs in order to learn. A 504 plan is different from an individualized education plan. You can have one, you could have the other, you can even have both, sometimes for the same condition and sometimes for different disabilities. 504 plans are only for K through 12. So while Section 504 does apply to colleges and universities that are federally funded, you do not get a 504 plan. Instead, it is a broader set of protections that we'll talk a little bit more about when we get to the ADA section. So to just compare an IEP and a 504 plan a bit more, IEPs include accommodations, modifications, and specialized instruction. So we talked about what some of those accommodations could look like a particular assistive technology. It could be sitting in the first row of the classroom because the student is easily distracted or is visually impaired and it's easier to see the board that way. Modifications would include changes to the actual instruction itself, shorter assignments, changes in the question wording, and specialized instruction is a larger umbrella. To receive an IEP, you need to go through that full evaluation process that we talked about earlier in the accessing services portion. An IEP will explicitly state who is giving the specialized instructions and services and now how often they are being delivered. An IEP will explicitly track progress. So that's the people who are providing services are making note throughout the year and through the yearly IEP meeting that progress is explicitly stated and noted. And an IEP is reviewed every year on that progress and explicitly reevaluated every 3 years, whether or not the student still qualifies for an IEP. 504 plans can include accommodations and modifications, just as we talked about, but not that level of specialized instruction. So it's really about the changes to the environment, not the instruction itself. So you can't just have a shorter assignment. It's about making the work and the education and the instruction accessible to the student, but not changing what that instruction actually looks like. You do not need a full evaluation for a 504 plan, but for many disabilities, it's common. It does not specify who is providing the specialized instruction because there isn't specialized instruction. There are services, but again, it does not specify the frequency. It would just be listed as what the accommodation or modification is. 504 plans do not explicitly track progress in the way that IEPs do, but they are reviewed and reevaluated. How often they are reviewed and reevaluated varies by state law, but often they are reviewed and reevaluated at a similar rate to IEPs, being reviewed yearly and reevaluated every 3 years. And for our third law, we have the Americans with Disabilities Act. So the Americans with Disabilities Act is a law that gives people with disabilities rights. It was passed in 1990. It is a very expansive law. It does not just apply to schools. It applies to public and private places, and ultimately is about people with disabilities being able to exist in the community. The ADA applies to the whole of the United States, and it says that governments and most public places have to be accessible to people with disabilities. For this reason, because of how broad the ADA is, in many ways it can overlap with Section 504, but ultimately extends who it applies to because it has a different definition of disability based around something called the activities of daily living. The ADA is ultimately an anti-discrimination law, meaning it protects people with disabilities from discrimination. What that means is usually places have to give something called reasonable accommodations. So accommodations are changes that make things easier for people with disabilities. They help us get the same things as people without disabilities. Reasonable accommodations are accommodations that you get to be able to be part of a program, service, or activity, including jobs and school. So a reasonable accommodation can look a lot like the accommodations we talk about in school, but there is a certain level where it may be considered unreasonable. And that determination around reasonable versus unreasonable has to do with something called an undue burden, but we'll get into more of that when we talk about Title II and Title III of the ADA. Quickly, I want to touch on ADA and effective communication. So discrimination is defined as treating someone badly based on who they are. And non-discrimination protections are rules that try to stop discrimination. And so when we're talking about the ADA, we're talking about protections that help disabled people be part of the larger community with non-disabled people as well. And how that applies to effective communication. Next slide, please. Those rules mean that people with communication disabilities have the right to communicate, to be part of a large community with people without communication disabilities. So communication is the different ways that people tell and show each other wants, needs, and other information. And so effective communication is communication that is accessible to us. It lets you share what you think and understands what other people say. And so in the case of effective communication, reasonable accommodations mean we have the right to services and technologies that help us communicate. So the ADA, like I said, is a very big law, and how it can protect people with disabilities in so many different places looks differently depending on what the place is. And it's broken up in the ADA by something called titles. So with Title II of the ADA, it explicitly talks about discrimination by the government, including government places like public schools and government services, like the post office. So it talks about what state and local governments and federal government, to an extent, must do for disabled people. State governments are the people who run each state, like the governor, and local governments are the people who run cities and towns, like the mayor. The reason why I said federal government to an extent is because that should already be covered by the Rehabilitation Act. We talked about Section 504, which has to do with places that the government federally funds. Well, there's also other sections that have to do with other parts of the federal government. Title II helps fill in some of those gaps with the rest of the federal government as well. So we talked about what reasonable accommodations are. And so when we're talking about what does reasonable mean, sometimes can be determined to be unreasonable by something called an undue burden. What that means is that giving the accommodation would be unfeasible, whether that because it's too expensive or too difficult to provide. In the case of Title II of the ADA, the government, place, or service, or the person in the government says what is an undue burden. How do you make sure that that's fair and actually following the law? Well, each department of the federal government has something called an Office of Civil Rights, and it will say if something is an undue burden. So in the case for schools under Title II of the ADA, the Department of Education's Office of Civil Rights will be the one to determine that. Because many government places and services receive federal funding, they have to follow Section 504 and Title II regulations. And the 504 regulations are the predominant ones, the more important ones that have to be referred to and checked to first. But in the case of public schools, that enforcement, that determination of undue burden or rights violation, that is handled by the Department of Education's Office of Civil Rights. So we just talked about Title II of the ADA. There's also Title III of the ADA. And while Title II of the ADA talks about the government and government provided services, Title III of the ADA talks about discrimination by public places. So what is a public place? Well, they're private businesses that provide goods and services to the public, meaning to everyone. They're very accessible and open and focused on the community. So what are some examples of these public places? Well, they're restaurants or stores or movie theaters or even certain private schools. So this means that Title III says colleges and universities that are private but not religious schools still have to give reasonable accommodations to students. And this is why, in addition to if the school receives federal funding through student aid, why private universities still have to have provide reasonable accommodations. And you may be familiar with that with a Office of Student with Disabilities or Disability Services. The name from school to school will change. When determining what is an undue burden, that is up to the public place still, which is ultimately a private business. And as a result, we see violations of Title III of the ADA, meaning that the public place is not following the law, much more often. Because Title III covers not just private schools, but also these private businesses, these public places more broadly, that enforcement, that oversight is done by the Department of Justice. So just put a lot out there. This has been around for a few decades now. And so when we're in a time that is very hectic, there's a lot of bad and frankly terrible things happening, it's good to check in to see what is happening with these laws. Are they safe? Are people still rights being protected? And frankly, a lot is happening in the federal government right now that is hurting disabled students. The government has expressed the desire to get rid of the Department of Education, which makes sure that these laws around students with disabilities getting a free and appropriate public education are followed. Like we said, the Department of Education, specifically that Office of Civil Rights, makes sure that public schools follow accommodations. And there are other offices in the Department of Education that also help schools make sure that they are following the law by providing guidance on how to follow the law and how to educate students with disabilities. And unfortunately, recently, a court said that the administration could fire half of the people who work at the Department of Education. And so a lot of this work that the department has been doing to protect the rights of students with disabilities is going to take longer. And it's going to be harder that if there something does go wrong, for that issue to actually be addressed. Something to also touch on is there is a ongoing court case around particular regulations for Section 504. We talked about this court case called Texas v. Kennedy in our last webinar. This case says, in 2024, the government changed some rules to Section 504's uses, specifically as it relates to making sure that disabled people are safe from healthcare discrimination. Some states are suing because of this change to the rules. Because it is around the changes in rules around Section 504 and healthcare, the decision in this case would not immediately affect Section 504 and education. Those are two separate sets of rules. But it could make how the government thinks about Section 504 and what Section 504 is supposed to do and what it's supposed to cover weaker. And so it could lead to a court case challenging the Section 504 education rules. It could lead to the Department of Education under this administration changing the regulations for Section 504 in education. And ultimately, it could make it harder to use Section 504 to keep disabled people safe. I know we said keeping questions to the end, but I do see one in chat I do want to touch on. A participant asked, what about the Department of Energy's attempt to erode 504? To touch on that briefly, what that means is that the Department of Energy of this administration put out something called a direct final rule, which is a rare and uncommon way to try and immediately change what the rules are around a particular regulation, specifically as it relates to Section 504. We put out a notice and toolkit around this attempt to change 504 as it relates to the Department of Energy, both because of how those changes specifically within the Department of Energy could hurt people, but also if that is interpretation, the administration goes and implements that in the Department of Energy without any kind of pushback, they will try to do it in some of these other departments like education, like health and human services, that would end up impacting even more people, to be quite frank. And so we appreciate everybody who participated in those public comments. Where that currently stands is that so many comments were received saying that do not make these changes, they're bad, they'll hurt people, they're actually not what the law says, that they said they're going to take another 60 days to review these comments, and then will let us know what they're going to do after that. and we'll be sure to provide an update when we reach that point. But unfortunately, the comment period is currently closed, so it's not something that you can continue to engage on, but there are other ways that we are acting to push on the administration to protect Section 504 and disability rights. Sorry, I hadn't done that slide yet. Thank you. So why does everything we just talked about matter? IDA, Section 504, ADA, as it pertains to education. Education, and especially public education, is an important part of making life better for everyone. That's because public education teaches things like reading, writing, math, and other things to 50 million students from kindergarten to 12th grade. And it is a place where these students can learn more about themselves and about their peers and how we, operate in society. It is a way for us to grow and develop and get to know each other and ourselves. And these protections and these rights ensure that disabled students are a part of that. And these attacks that we're seeing against education will hurt the millions of disabled students. Being able to go to school is important for every part of our lives. Schools decide things like where we work, where we live, and how we get health care later. And it means that more people can learn and advocate for ourselves. So even if you're not in school, why should you care? Disabled students have rights, and we must care about disabled students. If you are disabled, like I am, and you were a student, like I was, we were in that position as well. And even if we weren't in that position, it's important to care about everybody having that equal right and protection and ability to participate in society. And if the government can take away the rights of disabled students, they can take away the rights of disabled adults as well. We just talked about some of the attacks that are happening on 504 through the Department of Energy rulemaking. It could happen with the Department of Health and Human Services Section 504 rulemaking as well. And just to recap, the law says the Department of Education has to make people follow the laws. And with IDA, that means disabled students have the right to a free and appropriate public education and to be instructed in the least restrictive environment. Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act says disabled students have the right to accommodations in public schools. Title II of the ADA says disabled students have the right to not be discriminated against at school and other government places and services. And Title III of the ADA says disabled people have the right to not be discriminated against at public places like colleges and universities. So what can you do? Keep up to date with ASAN's plain language guides on our website in order to help. Sign up for our email list to get the most updated action alerts like we did with the Department of Energy 504 public comments. Work with self-advocacy groups in your state to protect disability rights. And we have some links to the ASAN affiliate groups that may be in your state, your local protection and advocacy agencies, and a number of self-advocacy groups. And ultimately try and find out what self-advocates in your state are doing to protect disability rights. So with that, thanks for listening. We do have a couple of questions that we'll go through. If you have a question that you have not yet asked and would like answered, feel free to put it in the Q&A box using the Zoom feature. And if you have any other questions that you would like answered that you would either like answered after the presentation or not related to today's presentation, feel free to email us at info@autisticadvocacy.org. And on the screen, we then have our social media links as well. Thank you. So just giving a quick moment. I answered the question on the Department of Energy's attempt to erode 504. We have a question from an attendee asking if an IEP is based on attendance. Can a student be denied an IEP or 504 plan based on their attendance record? And the answer to that is no, you cannot be denied based on your attendance. We have a question about the nature and severity of the disability. If the person who asked that question could try and be a bit more specific, because yeah, I'll come back to that one. Sorry about that. There's a question about, is there anything that says disabled parents have a right to attorney services that are accessible for other parents, for example? So this isn't necessarily just specific to schools. Everybody has a right to an attorney if, in the matter of in a legal sense, in terms of accessibility, that would actually be covered under Title III of the ADA, that the law services need to be provided in a way that are accessible to the disabled parent if they are contracting attorney services. There's a question about, are there any mentions of the use of seclusion and or restraints on disabled people in any of these acts? There is currently no federal legislation that regulates the use of seclusion and restraint on disabled people. It is not currently tracked. We are in support of legislation called the Keeping All Students Safe Act, or CASA, that would end seclusion, extremely limit the uses of restraint, and require states to report data on these uses. A participant asked, why can rich schools claim undue burden to provide a paraprofessional? Undue burden isn't always just about resources or money. Explicitly, the school may be giving a different reason as to why That may not be the actual reason, and they may or be trying to avoid just paying for it. And if you suspect that's the case, it's best to contact a contact a lawyer to help you with what next steps are. We have a question asking, what about UCEPS, UCEPS? If you mind spelling that out, that would be helpful.
Don, it looks like we've had USEPs elaborated on as AUCP programs.
I'm sorry, I can't say I'm familiar with what that is.
There was a typo.
Oh,
AUCP.
AUCD. Okay. Yeah, so like the LEND program. Yeah, I think in the case of the LEND program, which is that should be covered by Title II of the ADA at the very least. Beyond that, I would have to check. I'm sorry about that. I think it also depends on the specific university that is running the program as well. So Section 504 could also be at play. Oh, because federal funding. Yeah, so sorry, 504 and Title II. Next question. There's a question asking, I'm wondering what institutions that support students could do to best support students who may lose access to their resources. A specification about which institutions, if you mean the actual school itself that was providing the services, or libraries. So it depends on the services that are being lost. If it's, say, a student is being reevaluated for an IEP and the determination is that they are no longer eligible for an IEP, there may still be a way for the student to continue to receive services under a 504 plan. That happened to me, for example. And so referring the student, parent, or guardian to the other options would be helpful. Within the library itself, I mean, just doing your best to be accommodating to the student based on the student's needs. even if they don't have a particular set of accommodations, by communicating with the student and the student support network, is a way to provide that kind of mutual support even in the absence of any kind of legal requirement. There's a question if could a IEP plan pay for services like Linda Mood Bell. Linda Mood Bell is a private service for the sensory cognitive functioning of those with autism, ADHD, and dyslexia. I'm not familiar enough with Linda Mood Bell to be able to comment on that. I'm sorry. There's a question, are there any accommodations that are specifically protected or a list of example basic accommodations? Depending on the law, there are examples about what qualifies for a student to be covered. So as we talked about the 13 disability categories for IDA, or around those activities of daily living for the ADA. And so it's the examples have more to do with the like who can qualify, and then what those potential accommodations are not they're not explicitly stated in order to cast a broader net to be as least restrictive as possible, but there are certain accommodations that are more associated with certain disabilities than others. There's a question that says, can you say why 28 CFR 35.107 is not enforced and why schools do not have to have, sorry, you're gonna, I apologize, but you'll have to specify that 28 CFR 35.107. I don't have it off the top of my head. There's a question that says, when a para is part of the IEP but not provided, what can be done? I'm not in a place where I can provide specific legal advice, but if the IEP plan says the student must be provided a paraprofessional and one is not being provided, then I would contact an advocate who can help in that IEP meeting, or a lawyer to discuss the specifics of the individualized education plan and what justification, if any, for why the school is not providing the paraprofessional. We have a question, does undue burden also apply to IEPs? No, it can provide, it can apply to a specific accommodation that may have been requested to be part of an IEP, but once the IEP is established, it wouldn't be until the reevaluation period where, or some other kind of extenuating circumstance, where that would be reassessed. What are the... So we have a question about how to advocate for the laws we discussed today. And like we discussed at the end of the slide, at the end of the presentation on that final slide, you can get in contact with an ASAN affiliate group. You can join our mailing list where if there is an opportunity for public comment, and you can contact your representative and senators about the importance of these laws and your concerns about changes to the regulations overseeing these laws in this administration. And yeah, we also had links to other self-advocacy groups that you could potentially be a part of as well on that slide, which is another way to get involved. With the question around 28 CFR 35.107, I am happy to connect offline to discuss that more around its implementation in ways that it's not being followed. Right. Are there any other questions that I missed? I'm not seeing any in the panel. Were there any in the chat?
So we do have a question that I think came earlier in the presentation. If the attendee would like to clarify what they meant on, it says, do you have any tips on remembering which is which?
Between IDA 504, 501. I hope the slides where we compared 504 and IDA were helpful. There are some cheat sheets online that define the different sections of the Rehabilitation Act, so 504, 501, 503, 508, so on and so forth, and what parts of the federal government they apply to. I don't know if we have a preferred resource that we link out to that does this kind of compare and contrast. But just as a general rule of thumb, I think IDA, the fact that it is specific to those 13 disability categories, that is the most specific. You have to fall within one of those based off the evaluation. Then Section 504 is broader, and it may not just be, say, like a disability where we think of autism or ADHD or being blind. It can include things like food allergies, And then the ADA with that activities of daily living definition is the broadest, and the fact that it is specifically a non-discrimination law. So I hope that helped answer your question. So thank you, everyone. I hope this presentation was helpful, especially as we're coming up on back to school season. Like one participant marked in the chat, it is the 50th anniversary of IDA this year. It's also the 35th anniversary of the ADA, which we just passed 4 days ago. So thank you everybody for attending today. And if you have any, oh, sorry, we have two more questions in the feed. Who do you specifically recommend as advocates for an IEP meeting besides a lawyer? A local state, a local affiliate could potentially have, or self-advocacy group could have somebody. You may have local groups specifically focusing on IEP advocacy. Who else? You could contact your protection advocacy agency, and they may have people they may recommend, even though they are lawyers, if they themselves cannot attend for whatever reason. So I hope that's helpful. So what are the implications of the Department of Education losing potentially half of their staffing as it pertains to disabled students? Would it just impact the capacity for school systems to provide support? It isn't as much around the capacity for school systems to provide support. It has more to do with if the school system is violating the rights of the student, there is less oversight and less chance for recourse. Or in the case, so that's in the case of the Office of Civil Rights. In the case of, say, the Office of Special Education and Rehabilitative Services, or the Office of Secondary Education Programs, they provide guidance called technical assistance to the schools. So there may be a decrease in the quality of the services, or a particular understanding on how to address specific accommodations, or how they structure their support networks. We could also see with the appropriations process, which is currently ongoing, cuts to Title I funding. We could see IDA block granted. We really pushing back hard on that, and we have bipartisan support on that, to be clear, so I don't want to scare anybody too hard, but these are all things that are under consideration that would, if passed, if that funding is decreased, limit the accessibility of supports at school. Do schools have advisory committee to approve modifications under Title II and III? Every school is different on how they decide reasonable accommodations and modifications. Since we're talking about Title III as well, a lot of universities will have a office of disability services or office of like students with disabilities or some name similar to that. And there will be employees who are specific job to review the requested accommodations. Often, if the easiest way to get that approved is through a doctor's note, but again, not everybody has a specific diagnosis, and so the process can vary. All right, and with that, I believe we are wrapped up. So thank you everybody for joining, and if you have any more questions, please forward them to info@autisticadvocacy.org. Thanks everyone.
That is indeed the end. Thank you so much, John, and thank you to everybody for coming today. Y'all have a good rest of your day. Take care.